Hello, everyone. I am Ray Saldana, National President and CEO of Communities in Schools, here with another community chat. I want to thank you all who are joining us for our virtual discussion today and also in celebrating Women's History Month as we talk with two visionary women in policy about the connection, the intersection with the work that we do at Communities in Schools around integrated student supports and supporting students during this moment, how that intersection connects with policy reform and how we can ensure that students are empowered to succeed and that we're creating equitable conditions for their learning and for ultimately their outcomes. The two topics that we're going to talk about today coincide and really are happening at a critical time when we know that students have been just enduring a dismantling of lives in so many different ways through the pandemic, through COVID-19. So just to really give you all a backdrop of the discussion and the moment in history that we're going through now, there is an estimated, or what we know, an estimated 3 million students in the US who have gone, quote, missing during the pandemic. And not from home, but from virtual schools. And they are no longer attending classes and are most likely to be falling behind. And so even after the pandemic ends, many may never go back into school. So we are concerned and thinking about the work of engaging these students who are at risk of disengaging themselves. And we know that the work that our staff at Communities in Schools does every day all across the country is critical. But we're also devastated by this number that we're dealing with. And as parents and advocates for the nation's children, for many low-income students, inequitable learning conditions are unfortunately not new, but they have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And we're going to get into that in the conversation today. So here to help us kick off the conversation around the importance of broadband access and public policy, please welcome Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee from the Brookings Institute. Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee, are you there?
I'm here. Can you see me and hear me?
I can hear you, I can see you, and I hope that our audience can hear and see you. Thank you for joining us. Now, let me start by just asking how you and your family and your colleagues have been and how they've been coping over the last year.
Well, it's been tough. I mean, I'll give the two sides of the coin. It's been somewhat fine from the standpoint that we have been well physically, and that our family members, for the most part, have been well. This has been a really trying time as a person of color. I've lost several family members to this awful virus. But as we get towards what might look like the end, I'm grateful and blessed that we are still here. In terms of my children, one is on campus studying virtually within a dorm room, and the other one was studying up until the other day virtually in her bedroom. And so I can tell you it has been, I just want to say to all the people that are teachers, you're heroes and sheroes, because having a full-time job and then doing that role, it's a lot. So I just, I cannot be more grateful to the folks that stepped in, have stepped in over the years to do what you do.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Turner-Lee, for sharing that and for giving us a glimpse of how somebody who is as incredibly busy, especially in this moment, thinking about policies that directly are impacting, that you're researching, that in this moment, you're spending a little time with us at Communities in Schools and in conversation. So if I can, let's jump into a few questions. Dr. Turner-Lee, you were recently on PBS in a special where you were quoted as stating that the pandemic has highlighted just how intricately related the lack of broadband access is to systemic inequality. And I also read your piece in the Democracy Journal where you talk about a tech new deal to ensure that no student is left offline. So can you share some insights into your research topic focused on how public policy is designed or being designed to enable equitable access to technology across the US?
It's such a great question, and it's one that keeps me up at night, I have to admit. I just can't get to sleep because I think about prior to the pandemic that there were 13 to 15 million people that were disconnected from the internet. I'm finishing up a manuscript for my first book, which is on the US digital divide. And I had the opportunity to go across the country and meet many of these people in the cities and states, urban, rural, suburban, to really come to the same theme that they're digitally invisible, particularly when you're low income, a person of color, you're older, you're rural, or you're foreign born. And we have to address that because the pandemic really demonstrated just how important it was to be connected. The fact that we couldn't get to doctors or learn within public school buildings or even shop for that matter or see our loved ones via this thing that we're doing now, right? I mean, it just showed how important it is to be connected to broadband. And as we think about this issue of what the pandemic sort of highlighted, we have to remember that this has been a decade-long problem that we've had. The digital divide is not new, it's just gotten further complicated as we move away from analog society or in-person society to online environments. And for those of you who think that the pandemic is just going to go away and we're all going to just show up in person, it's not going to happen because we now have created a habit where this efficiency is actually going to drive, I think, the next layer of economic recovery, much what you saw in my Tech New Deal. I mean, Biden just announced today broadband as part of the infrastructure plan. And in the previous stimulus bills, we've seen, billions of dollars as down payments to get universal broadband access to millions of people who are disconnected. What I would say to that in terms of your question, and particularly for schools, what I found to be so challenging was that schools did not have any idea of this problem. They kind of knew that kids would come to school hungry. They knew that kids were coming to school with probably challenges within the household, potentially, being exposed to things that children should not be exposed to. I'm sitting here, Ray, watching the George Floyd trial yesterday and today, realizing that young kids, 14 and under, were the ones that recorded that violent offense. But when we think about that, and we think about the fact that these children, particularly those that lived in households where their parents had to go off to work, schools didn't know when 50 million school age kids were sent home and 15 to 16 million of them were kids without either home broadband or an internet enabled device, 9 million students of color, and to what you just shared, 3 million that we can't even find. But schools did not realize just how that was going to affect the normal course of learning. And I'll close here on just some of the questions. We can talk more because I know we have a short period of time. I've spent this last year talking to educators, administrators, civil society groups, policymakers, that we have to make sure, I don't care if schools reopen and open the doors physically, we have to plan for this. I had a superintendent Ray on my event at Brookings a couple of months ago who said, Nicole, we're dealing with the pandemic and the wildfires in California. We're not only losing them for the pandemic, but we're losing them because of this natural disaster. So I would just suggest to people, we need a mandate policy-wise that says no child is left offline. They need to have a tablet with a textbook, a pencil with a Wi-Fi hotspot, and the ability to be ready for the next generation of jobs in this economy that is quickly changing from inline to online.
Well, Dr. Turner-Lee, I think it's such a treat that we get the opportunity to hear from you directly because you are in many ways, as I had the opportunity to read some of your material and learn about your background, you're at the front line of this issue. And you're right, we've been talking about digital divide for such a long time, but you really are in a place where you are, consulting with superintendents, with administrations at state and federal level. And so it is just so critical now that we understand the intersection of all of these issues. And when we think about a system that we want to build back, that you really highlight how important this critical issue is for our students. So I was thinking of a separate question that is somewhat related, but what are some of the current key tech policy issues that are and continue to impact the academic advancement if we're focused on students in our country?
Well, clearly what we realize in this pandemic, because of the inability of us to connect schools into the home directly, that we have to address this problem of residential broadband access. There are people, I don't care where they live. I mean, in rural America, they're not close to a facility. In urban America, they got to choose between broadband and bread. But there are people who still have challenges in getting residential broadband. And so I'm really excited about some of the recent movement to expand the E-rate program, which technically was all about connecting schools and libraries, but now it may be permitted to change the statute enough to get it into the home. They're still trying to figure out what this broadband benefit looks like, but I'm excited that may actually happen under the acting chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, who's talked about closing the homework gap. I also think that there's this opportunity, particularly in the work that you all do, to start transforming what became digital parking lots, young kids sitting in front of Taco Bells and libraries doing homework, into digital parks and finding partners in open spaces, much like communities and schools. I always told educators a lot of times, the school is in the community, folks, right? And so there's this partnership that needs to evolve. We should never have a young child sit on a Taco Bell stoop doing their homework. We need to create safe, open spaces and look at the 100,000 plus businesses that have closed. Those are opportunities for physical space to bring people together. And then I would just say, third, we need an all hands on deck strategy. I think when we think about it in terms of policy, we want policymakers to turn the switch on and off. Well, in this country, the U.S. Department of Education doesn't necessarily have oversight over broadband, and the Federal Communications Commission has the oversight over broadband, but not education. We need much more interagency collaboration. This is a Department of Labor issue, social service issue, education issue, and honestly, it's an American issue. And so the more people we have at the table, philanthropy, corporations, I think we'll get closer to realizing just how important it is. I know I'm out of time, but I want to say this real quick. Our kids are going to struggle coming out of this, mental health wise. They're confused on why they had to be online. But let's think of it this way, they're also learning the skills of the 21st century. I tell my daughter all the time, whenever she sees me on here, she's like, Eek, you're on that thing again in front of that camera. I can't take it. I tell her, listen, girlfriend, this is what your world is going to look like when it goes into the next generation of work. This is going to be a disaggregated future of work environment. So we got to figure out where the good is, but we also need people to collect these stories so we can figure out where the deficiencies were when we were trying to roll this out.
Gosh, yeah, that is such a great example. I mean, when my son who's 2, when I ask him where it is that I work, he doesn't say communities and schools. He says I work at the keyboard. So I think you're right. But I actually it's on that frame of mind as we think about educators and the education landscape and where it's going. In what ways do you think educators can really harness the power of technology to create change in communities and re-engage with students? Obviously, a lot of the things you mentioned have to be true around policy and the intersection of departments and cross collaboration. But what is there to harness that you think is really to the benefit of our educators?
Well, we need educators to understand that they're part of the broadband solution, right? And so, educators, I'll give you a couple of examples. I've helped some schools, for example, have an intake form that asks students, much like we do for their address when we're enrolling them, what's your broadband service? Who's your provider? How much access do you have in your house? We have this insecurity of broadband where it's important for the educators to not only know how are our kids connected, but one of the policies that I'm working on is I think every affordable housing complex in the United States should have access to broadband. There's just no reason we didn't have Wi-Fi hotspots in federally assisted housing or homeless shelters. But for educators, knowing this information helps us actually identify what I call blind spots when we're trying to put access. So I would say educators get some information. I think it's also important, and again, for the heroes and sheroes that are watching this, that educators realize that, yes, that little bit of what you did made a whole lot of difference to that child. I am a part of the PTA at my daughter's school. All of our meetings have been virtually, but I've just been taken by the stories of our principal who has said things like, the type of homelessness that's happened under this pandemic has him putting in his car food to bring to families or checking the counselor going to their homes or getting the kid into the environment. Educators continue to be creative. We will eventually, working with organizations like Communities and Schools, figure out how to frame the Post-it notes that you all wrote on. The back of the envelope conversations will eventually become part of the way that we reimagine education. So keep hope alive and keep pushing forward, because I think at the end of the day, Ray, we're going to learn from this in ways that I think will improve upon our outcomes as well as our creativity in the classroom to motivate our students. We just got to find them and get them in there.
On that point, the find them, and I know that's a lot of the work that our psych coordinators have been doing because of just well built-in relationships. But I think it's in that I take from what you described at the beginning around invisible people, and sometimes how often it is that you can do more harm to somebody who doesn't have a lot of power, isn't able to advocate for themselves. And so kind of a final question before we transition here is how has having increased access to digital world helped kids participate in civic engagement to advocate for themselves and their communities? Used an excellent example right now with the George Floyd case, but I wonder how we can continue to increase advocacy with digital access.
I love that question because I have a very inquisitive, woke 14-year-old daughter who, despite my pleas to get off of certain properties, has used that to educate me about issues that I didn't know about. Her connectedness, I think, to this new generation of leaders that are civilians standing on a street corner. I've had tears all day today and yesterday as I think about what George Floyd went through, but more tears for that 14-year-old who had the courage to stand there and tell that story and then get on the stand in support of, a conviction. But I also have equal respect for young people. for students that have seen that technology is not just about consumption, it's about creation. And it's also one of those tools, despite the long hours in front of the screen, that's actually enabling them the same way that typing, and I'm not going to date myself too much, right? But learning how to fix cars really helped us, when we were in high school or in elementary or middle school. So again, I hope that we're able to take this new administration's aspirations of connecting everyone and connect the dots. And that's why I call that the Tech New Deal race. So I'm glad you read it, because it's really about the fact that the technology train has left the station. So let's use that for economic recovery. And let's stop putting digital access 10th on the list and realize that this is now the gold that is going to define the global economy. And our kids, yes, they got to be scientists. Yes, they got to be engineers, but they got to know how to use this stuff, not just buying it, but they got to know how to create it.
I love that you gave those viewers who have children a really great key in, which is that we are all consumers, but to think about this as creation really does get you to a next level order of using the technology, and why access is so critically important. So Dr. Turner-Lee, thank you. We're going to hear a little more from you later in the show. And as we discussed, there's some great resources that can be offered to assist students in harnessing the power of technology to create change, re-engage with students, and especially those who have fallen behind. So as students return to school buildings, it may help reverse learning loss and bring some of the missing children back, or invisible as we oftentimes find some of these communities. But it won't solve the problem entirely if children's social and emotional needs are unmet and their families are still struggling to provide even the basic needs. And so here to discuss the importance of equitable remote learning, somebody who I think flashed on your screen briefly is Monika Kincheloe from the America Promise Alliance. Monika, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Can you see me and hear me?
I can hear you, and I hope that our audience can see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, let me just start again the way I started with Dr. Turner-Lee. Can you just tell me how you've been coping with everything, how everything's been going for the last year for you, your family, your colleagues?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. We are great fans of communities and schools, so I'm happy to join. I think the last year has been really challenging, both personally and professionally. We've all stretched ourselves in lots of different directions, but there have also been some really incredible moments of joy and success. I welcomed a baby boy back in October, and I also at America's Promise got to stand up a new body of work to work with a number of partner organizations, including CIS, to create what we're calling an anti-racist alliance. And I think I'm just really encouraged by the fact that we can still do great work. And I have the privilege, frankly, of getting to work still now. And that forces me into a place of gratitude. So I think I'm lucky that I work with a lot of colleagues who are of the same frame of mind, and we get to do what we do. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We at Communities and Schools have had such a strong partnership and relationship with the folks over at American Alliance, starting with the Grad Nation in 2010, and really tracking our ability to make sure to capture those students who have been at risk of dropping out. And so really just excited to be in conversation. So how about we jump into a few questions. So as I mentioned when we opened, for many low-income students, inequitable learning conditions are not new. But they have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So if we can, let's discuss maybe some solutions to provide whole child supports that meet students' needs outside the classroom, and how we can provide better equitable remote learning for those who are in the audience listening in. And so the first question I wanted to ask you was what are some key areas that are essential to effective and equitable remote learning?
Sure. I think the, remote learning, like you said, is likely to be with us for a long time, even after the effects of the pandemic subside. So it's worth knowing what the ideal state of remote learning is. I think we've spent a lot of time already with Dr. Turner-Lee talking about connectivity, reliable internet access, broadband access. So I'll dispose of that piece. I think the next critical piece is devices. We know that a lot of communities ramped up and accelerated their one-to-one device efforts. It's really hard for some families to say, yes, we can have our kid in remote learning and we have all the tools to do that. We know of families that are sharing one device among multiple siblings. And Matt, you can't share a backpack or a set of books necessarily throughout the day. So it's the same for a computer or a tablet. So this idea of one-to-one and really making sure that there's space available for those multiple devices in a household is also key for remote learning. The last piece is probably the most nuanced, which is the learning environment. Most of our homes were not designed to be learning environments in the traditional academic sense. And so for those of us who are working, try to imagine all the struggles and challenges you're having as a working adult, and know that the young people are dealing with the same exact challenges because they can't move about their lives the way they usually do. And so this learning environment in an ideal state is a calm, inspiring place where young people can focus and engage with their learning. And they need access to adults who can provide the emotional and academic supports that they need to get through the school year. So this is really where the most interesting creativity, I think, has come through when it comes to remote learning. And we've seen all the viral videos of totally inspiring teachers and mentors and the drive-by parades. But we have to remember that remote learning can't be the only option forever. And so I think even if it is here to stay in some form, ideally we're moving to a more hybrid system, because learning is a social and emotional endeavor, and we can't lose the important body language, social cues, eye movements. Those are actually the unspoken parts of a relationship. And we can't achieve that level of emotional and social connection with young people, the kind that really builds their ability to learn and to access material. We can't do that solely through remote learning. So truly equitable remote learning it will involve connectivity, devices, and an appropriate learning environment. But really the ultimate equity position is to have a hybrid with in-person as well.
Monika, thank you for laying that out. I think you probably did that in the most relatable way that you can for somebody who isn't a researcher, who isn't trying to predict what the future of public education looks like, when you talk about how difficult it can be for those who are working from home, or for those who identified just the way their homes can or can't be the kinds of conditions, or create the kind of conditions that create great learning. And so I just want to sort of think about a question here, which is, now we've gone through this experiment, and you are somebody who follows the research, and you are somebody who understands what lessons we have learned from the first year of remote learning. You talked a little bit about some of those examples. So what lessons can schools use to help prepare for success in the upcoming school years, if it is hybrid and if it is a version that's different? What are the lessons that we learned through this?
Sure. I think my biggest hope is that we don't keep doing this 100% remote learning. I think we've just, as your remarks at the top of this half hour indicated, we're losing young people 100% from the system, meaning they're not logging in, or they're not meeting the engagement metrics that have been recalibrated during this remote learning period. So for example, just measurements of how many students are logging in, how long they're staying on, did they put their cameras on, are they engaging in the chat? Those aren't great metrics for learning. They're great metrics for, do you know how to use Zoom, or do you know how to use Google Teams? And so our lesson really has to be that we've got to find a way to get to hybrid or in-person learning. And I think once we do that, we need to also acknowledge and create space in the start of the school year, and at the end of this school year, even perhaps over the summer, to double down on the aspects of a young person's life that just weren't nourished, frankly, over the last year. And so that's likely in the space of connectivity. And in this case, I don't mean internet connectivity, I mean person-to-person connectivity and that relationship piece. Who is that young person's champion in the school building? And I have to put that in quotes now, because we aren't seeing widespread enough in-person learning. So what does a new set of practices look like in a school? We've heard a lot about wellness checks, and schools that did not previously do one-to-one check-ins with every young person and every family, but now are doing that and are saying, we're not going to stop doing this. You can't start engaging with young people and their families in a deep way, like some of them have during this year, and then all of a sudden stop. It becomes a critical, valuable data point. And so I think learning more about our communities and our young people is a critical piece that has to continue, even with remote learning. I think Dr. Turner-Lee raised a really interesting point too, of we've got to build in access to devices and internet as part of what we know about every single student and family. I think the last thing I'll just add here is around learning itself, and we can talk about this a little bit later too. we have an opportunity to really reimagine what we consider to be learning. And prior to the pandemic, I think there was a steady drumbeat of efforts in this direction of really acknowledging and integrating the social, emotional, and cognitive aspects of learning. We need to do that even more now than ever. And I know that's probably an overstated phrase, but we have an opportunity to really reimagine how learning happens, and that it's not the typical rote memorization, the standard being tracked into AP classes or IB classes. We should really be valuing a range of ways to learn and assess that learning, and to include project-based learning and portfolio assessments. And then making sure that we've got the structures in place so that young people can access that content.
Monika, I think you touched on a question that I was going to ask when you talked about what this opportunity has presented for us around recalibrating and redefining the way learning is conceived of for parents, for educators, as we think about what it looks like to track and make progress on social emotional health. What we shouldn't unlearn about what we've learned, which is connection and community programming, access to schools that are really the social safety nets for food security and stabilization, that needs to be true even afterwards. So thank you for really outlining important lessons. I had sort of one more final question, which is that looking here, you were quoted at the Council of State Governments in 2019 as saying that the focus on building new partnerships that address all of the barriers, which you've talked about here, including non-academic factors such as chronic absenteeism, economic instability, and trauma, that can keep students from finishing school. It's not just about the school, it's about the community as well. So tell us, what are those types of partnerships, what those partnerships can look like for students, families, and organizations like America's Promise Alliance to ensure that kids who were forgotten before COVID-19 are getting through the pandemic, as well as through the difficulties just of everyday life?
Yeah, it's an important question. I really think partnerships between schools and districts and a number of nonprofit organizations and CBOs is the number one reason we have not seen even more harm to young people during the last year. But if I break that fact down even further, I have to acknowledge that these partnerships exist to fill a gap that society just has refused to fill over the years. And in fact, has created a system that works against many of the communities and young people we work with and for whom we partner. So I think the current state of partnerships in communities is really strong and important, and is that safety net. But I think what I'm very interested in learning with other organizations through our anti-racist alliance work, and really want to get everybody thinking about, is what would it look like if we didn't have to fill these gaps? What would it look like to really reverse, to name, describe, and dismantle the system that is really rooted in racism and classism, that is creating such a different set of opportunities for the young people and communities we serve? COVID blew the top off on all of this. You know, the top had been off for many of us already, but I think COVID now has made it abundantly clear to a larger proportion of the population how incredibly unfair many of our systems are. And so I would like to see these partnerships after COVID take this moment and take this opportunity to work against that system and rebuild it into something else.
Monika, thank you so much for summarizing in a lot of ways the way that we feel at communities and schools, thinking about the big picture here and recognizing that what is true about the world today is how interconnected we all are, and gone are the days where we can just assume that digital divide is somebody else's problem to fix, or social emotional learning and non-academic issues that need to happen and be supported in schools is somebody else's focus. It really is all of ours. And at America's Promise, you all are really leading in that collaboration. So closing up here, before we wrap up, I know we're close to time, but like many of us, I know that we're juggling work and life and family from home. So maybe in a short brief, for both Monika and Dr. Turner-Lee, what message do you have for parents and caretakers of students who are working to manage their households through these challenging times? So Monika, if we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I love this question. So I have a 5-month-old and a 3-year-old, and my biggest advice is be a human. I think we need to dispose of this idea that parents are superheroes and can be teachers and caretakers and parents and great partners all the time. So be human, give yourself grace, And when those things falter and you might have a moment with your kids, don't be afraid to apologize. I'm amazed at the grace that my 3-year-olds can give me when I have a tough moment. And I just say, I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I'm having big feelings. I hope you can forgive me. Just be real. And I think being that way with your family when things are really tough for this long is the best we can do.
Thank you so much, Monica, for being real with us in this conversation. And Dr. Turner-Lee, let me turn to you.
Yeah, no, and I'll be quick. And if I can, Ray, just before we wrap up and I give that, Monica, I appreciate what you said, right, in terms of just democratizing education, because as you mentioned, it's so important that we realize that the challenges that we had before the pandemic among Black, Brown, tribal, rural, poor kids, it was the same challenge. And we just cannot face another Brown versus Board of Education when it comes to having the right resources to compete in 21st century education. So I had to get that out because I think that's so important. So I appreciate everything that you said and your organization as well. I just say to parents, get vaccinated when it's your turn. Keep wearing a mask so we all can get out of this, and recognize that you did the best that you could with the resources that you had. No one on this call who actually had, gone through this had an expert panel and an expert manual that said this is what you do. And we should all just thank ourselves if we were able to get out of this, like I said in the beginning of this, alive. Because there's some people who didn't wake up. And we should be thankful that our children, even in some of the mental health concerns that will come out, but we should be thankful that we're all a village. We all went through this shared experience, and together we're going to get out of it. So just keep patting yourself on the back. It was rough for everybody, right? This is one of those moments. But the key thing is, this is the greatest part about life, when our children experience that living history and they learn from it and they become change agents as a result. So thank you for having me as well.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
to
you.
Nicole. Thank you so much to Monika for joining us in this conversation as we celebrate just two important policymakers, researchers leading your organizations in important ways and thinking about the very long road, but important road ahead for all of us. And to the audience who tuned in, thank you for watching us. We hope you can join us the next month. We're so grateful that we get to celebrate Women's History Month with important voices from women, understanding important critical issues that are impacting all of us in our work throughout our lives in so many intersectional ways. So again, same time next month, please be well to everyone. And always, if you want to learn more about communities in schools, please visit us online at communitiesinschools.org. Thank you again for joining us. And again, Monika and Nicole, for being with us in conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.